Hello, and welcome to the Health GoLIVE webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Microsoft. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature will be available, so feel free to send in your questions for our speakers throughout the discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator who joins us from Microsoft, Dave Myers.
Thank you, Nicole. I want to say hi to everybody and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I think we've got a great topic and some fantastic panelists that we're going to discuss with today. Some of the changing trends and drivers behind what's been happening as a result of COVID in the CRO market, R&D, and drug discovery. In particular, we're going to delve into the evolving role of CROs in supporting pharmaceutical, biotech, medical equipment companies to expedite new life-saving medicines, treatments, and services. Talk a little bit about the changing regulatory requirements as a result of that, and why CROs are turning to cloud to reimagine the clinical trial process as we move into a more long-term, sustainable sort of hybrid, decentralized models around research trials and studies. We'll also talk about the transition from physical work sites to remote work models for both employees and patients, and how that's improving patient experiences. So with that, I want to, first of all, welcome our two panelists. I'm going to introduce them to the audience today, and then we'll jump right into some topics that are front and center to the discussion today. So first of all, I want to introduce Kate LaBelle. She leads a team of strategy and operations professionals, chiefs of staff, if you will, in AbbVie's Pharmacovigilance and Patient Safety Department. Her team supports strategic planning, transformation initiatives across process, technology, and data. And prior to AbbVie, Kate spent about 12 years in management consulting, advising health system and life sciences executives on a variety of mission-critical topics: new business growth, operational efficiency, and digital transformation. Before her consulting career, Kate managed multi-million-dollar CRO relationships at several pharmaceutical companies, including TAP Pharmaceuticals, Takeda, and their global R&D operations. Kate is based in Chicago. And welcome, Kate. Thank you for joining us today. Our next panelist that I want to introduce is Adam Mariano. He's from IQVIA. He leads the product and strategy for IQVIA's integrated health practice. His team supports innovative models that support life sciences companies, patient advocacy groups, and medical specialty societies in engaging patients in studies and long-term follow-up. Prior to IQVIA, Adam spent about 15 years in consulting and advising of health systems and health plans on how to use data as a corporate asset for improving care. Outside of his technical work, Adam is also an attorney focusing on supporting underserved communities with civil rights and immigration issues. Adam has a bachelor's in computer science and master's in public health, and he is based in the Philadelphia area. And typically, I held back, but typically I would have made a joke about him playing an attorney on TV, but he actually is an attorney and focused again on supporting those initiatives within underserved communities. So we appreciate that, Adam, and thank you for joining us today as well. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation or the discussion, with COVID, there have been a number of dynamics, megatrends, if you will, or themes that have emerged. And while it's been, one of the most challenging times for each of us in terms of our life and health and normalcy, there are some silver linings there when it comes to new emerging models for work and for research, and in particular, bringing new drugs and therapeutics to market in a much shorter life cycle. And we want to talk about a little bit about that today in terms of those themes, those mega trends that we've seen, unprecedented types of partnerships, companies that would normally, or institutions that would normally be fierce competitors, collaborating in new ways around the mission of, solving the COVID pandemic. So it's been an exciting time. We've seen new business models emerge, new collaborations emerge, new technologies emerging, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit with our panelists today. So I'll put the question out there, both for Kate and for Adam. What types of new collaborations and partnerships have you seen or experienced as a result of COVID?
You want to go first?
We're both volunteering the other. I'm happy to start. It's been interesting. We've seen a bunch of interesting collaborations across the retail market. So you're seeing a lot of retail institutions get engaged in trying to support studies and trial onboarding. You're seeing, obviously, telehealth has drifted into partnership with everyone, and some surprising partnerships between telehealth organizations and EMR companies, which were sort of almost mortal enemies for a while, both sort of frenemies, if you will. You've seen them mix with retail pharmacies. You've seen them mix with folks like Amazon and others who are looking to engage sort of that end-to-end health spectrum. And I think as we get more and more into the direct-to-patient, decentralized trials, hybrid study world, those capabilities, telehealth, direct patient engagement, mobile-based platforms, looking at direct patient, so from a collections perspective, patient-mediated data sources, so device data, passive data, things coming out of the EMR. All of those burgeoning opportunities have risen both because of COVID, where people really just couldn't go to sites, and the volume of visits that were available really shrunk because people turned off all of the elective procedures and all the elective visits, and really were just delivering critical care. To now, over the last two to 3 years now, we've had people really adjusting to what does that look like when you have remote access and remote visits. How do you enable those capabilities? So I think you're seeing a lot of the tech partnerships resurge. We had that big arc 10 years ago with tech and healthcare at the start of EMRs. Everybody was going to be an EMR add-on. And now we're back to, again, people engaging in Smart on Fire, people engaging in ancillary tools around the apron of healthcare delivery. I think it's interesting. Kate, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, excellent, Adam. Just to add a couple of points. I mean, I think we're living now in an era of decentralized clinical trials, which is really exciting when you think about all of the work we do is really focused on the patient, right? And meeting the patient where they are. Patient support programs is an interesting area that I've been following, particularly in my role in pharmacovigilance. And Dave, time permitting, can give a little background on pharmacovigilance for those in the audience that may not be familiar with that function.
Yes, please.
Okay, so maybe we'll just take a brief pause, but I kind of feel like the COVID-19 era introduced the world to this funny word, which is really arguably one of the most important disciplines within R&D in the life sciences space. But pharmacovigilance is really a need to have not a nice to have, right? It's a required function that really focuses on monitoring the safety of products, both in development and on market. And how do we do that, right? Well, it's all about data. We collect it, we analyze it, we interpret it, we communicate it to regulators, to patients, to HCPs. And an interesting thing about pharmacovigilance is it really does span the entire R&D and commercial organization, looking really objectively at clinical and epidemiological data. And as you can imagine, pharmacovigilance as a discipline has become incredibly complex in this new era of technology that we face really in the last 10 years, certainly in the last 5 years. When we think about social listening, as one example, human factors and what we now know about how patients engage and providers engage with our products. So as pharmacovigilance becomes a more complex discipline, that is where I think CROs can particularly serve as strong strategic partners. And we'll get into that a bit more, but did want to do some quick level setting on terms.
That's great. No, that's helpful. And I think there are implications from both a technology perspective and I think also benefiting the researchers and the research function that we've seen come out of COVID. So there's been unprecedented data sharing with COVID, from surveillance data to, diagnoses and studies. And I'm curious, Adam, if you have any thoughts on how technology has helped or enabled that data sharing and this support of not just the pharmacovigilance function, but as it expands into more uses of, in addition to pharmacovigilance, using real world data for other purposes.
I'm busy talking on mute. I think there are a whole host of wins we've had here. I think you've just by natural function, patients have had to get comfortable with things like telehealth. There's every week for a year and a half, there was an article about the uptick in telehealth and how telehealth is here to stay. If I see one more article about that, but it's true, right? It's not a thing to poo-poo. It's really going to be the pathway forward is to really expand the apron of care and data collection through things like telehealth and through direct PRO collection, even passive data sources where you're asking patients to provision data off of their watches, for argument's sake, through their phone. There's a bunch of wins. The easy wins, the ones that I think are critical, are the pragmatic use cases. So you see the FDA asking for pragmatic data. You're seeing people asking to see more representative sampling of patients, maybe reducing some of the barriers to participation, because now patients don't have to be at a healthcare facility visit during 9 to 5. They can actually participate off hours and collect data themselves. But also some data that was harder to collect. So social determinants, barriers to care, things of that nature that really you're only going to get directly from patients. There's an opportunity to speak directly with them when you're working through some of these data sources. And I think the other piece to this is looking at all of the ancillary data sources that we've started to see people take really, really great advantage of. So patient-mediated EMR data, right? So if you've got HealthKit on your phone, or you've got Common Health on your Android phone, if you're not an iPhone user, you have the ability now to carry around a health wallet, and you can share that data with any third party you want to. And the Cures Act now mandates that healthcare providers and payers have to share that data with you. So you've put some control of that data in patients' hands. You'd offer them an ability to now share that as part of studies and trials and registries. And so that data is now readily available. And now you're seeing the advancement of NLP to start to drive some value out of even the text elements in that data. So where you get narratives now with the US CDI data source. Lots and lots of opportunity, I think, to drill down on data that was relatively inaccessible not too long ago. And so you're now seeing everybody react with how do we deal with this from a storage and a compute and a process perspective, and then how do we align that to the limitations of automated data collection. So it's an interesting arc and a little evolutionary step that's happening right now. We're deeply engaged in.
Yeah, again, I think one of those silver linings really to come out of COVID was the acceleration of that. And I think a lot of the technologies that are enabling that in terms of connectors and interoperability with standards like FHIR and CDISC and others, the ability to connect and share that data much more rapidly, I think has been key. I think I'm curious, Kate, as you think about the role of pharmacovigilance during COVID and even longer term, I mean, the cycle time of during COVID of collecting data and monitoring adverse events and conducting study follow-up and many other aspects of just the cycle time has just been shortened tremendously. And I'm curious if you could comment on that. And again, longer term, how has it evolved over the last several years?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that we think about every day, right? I mean, it's real-time collection and monitoring of information, and then enabling real-time decision making so that we can do our best as sponsors to get information to the regulators, to the patients, to the healthcare providers. Of course, COVID-19 has just created a incredible opportunity and really precedent to collect that information as quickly as possible. Adam sparked a couple of thoughts in my mind as he was sharing some opinions on kind of the technology enablement, right, of data collection. And I think about the role of patient support programs with PSPs, which have evolved tremendously over the last 20 years. And these programs are an incredible means actually to connect with patients in real time, to get information from them, to answer questions, and really to get this additional incredibly valuable insight into the whole patient, how the patient is engaging with the product, with their healthcare providers, understanding human factors, financial considerations, access. I mean, talking about social determinants of health, transportation considerations, looking at what type of wraparound services they may need, from mental health to fitness programs, nutrition. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I think your question of is this kind of rapid kind of real-time collection and communication and decisioning sustainable? I think the answer is it has to be, and I think to Adam's points, we definitely are have the technological capability to make that happen. What I think about from a sponsor perspective is just generally for any sponsor is really looking internally to look at readiness, right? To look at organizational readiness from an operations standpoint. How are we intaking this information? How are we looking at internal processes to ensure that we can continue to take on and review this information? And I think that change management piece is actually where CRO partners can really support sponsors as strategic partners.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, and I think it is true that CROs can play a pivotal role in that change management and transforming the business of clinical research and the resulting outcomes. I think both of you have mentioned the addition of non-traditional data types and data sources, and I think there's a impact from that on the patients. The outcomes can be improved with access to additional information and the insights that come from that. There are also technical implications that enable that, and also can foster innovation around how we deal with the whole patient. I'm curious, Adam, I'll ask you first. What's the prevalence of non-traditional data sources and data types that you're seeing in the CRO space? And
I think to Kate's point, we're often asked now to lead the innovation strategy with folks as they're getting to the second, I'll call it the second half of their digital journey, right? The first half was, we need mobile applications. The second half is now that you're getting guidance from the FDA around digital health technologies, right? There was just recent guidance that came up about how we should be leveraging it and what are the caveats there and what should be prioritized. If you really go down this pathway, we're seeing I would use the word explosion, but it's often overused. But you really are seeing a rapid proliferation of this from a multitude of spaces. I think go back to device data, depending on whether or not you're actually capturing true medical devices, which has always been part of the mix. So if you had a surgical device, you're an implant, you're always capturing data coming off that device. But now you're looking at consumer devices and post-care devices, looking at the quality of life, looking at post-treatment experiences of patients, relative outcomes. So digital scales, inspirometers, watches, any device that the patient may be able to automatically provision their data from. And that there's a bunch of easy ways to get to that data now. So there's APIs from the vendor, the patient can provision their account directly. Lots of opportunity to bring that data in as part of regular process. But then EMR integration and claims integration, EMR is now becoming a much more, I would call it, respected data source. I think people have started to understand how to deal with the ins and outs. What are the complexities around concomitant medications? How do you deal with narrative data? NLP is having its second coming, I think, under this vein now that the narratives are required under US CDI and FHIR requirements. So you actually have things like H&P and procedure notes and discharge notes that you can call for information around outcomes, around reasons for switching, reasons for discontinuance or non-compliance. All of those things are now available. And so when you start to talk about leveraging targeted analysis to look at clear clinical concepts that were essentially unavailable unless you went to a PRO or an ECRF and asked the provider directly to transcribe stuff from the chart, you now have an ability to take that in an automated fashion. And so everyone we talk to is really trying to figure out how to leverage these data sources at scale. And so now we're back to, well, how do you build an effective data pipeline? How do you build effective use of NLP? How do you validate that process? How do you do codification in an automated way at scale? And if you think about, previously you'd have a couple of forms that you'd ask a provider to fill out as part of the EDC system. You collect maybe a little bit of PRO from the patient, you're done. But now you're saying, all right, well, now I want 6 years of history from a patient. I want a 5 or 6 year look back across all of their EMR data. You're now dealing with some significant data scale that you're now going to have to parse and think about how to natively deal with FHIR, because that's the source it comes in. And most folks don't even know what FHIR looks like, much less how to process it after the fact. And so we're on an interesting journey with folks, teaching them about, hey, this data is just another format, right? It's not new technology, it's new to life sciences. We've been doing it in the registry space for a long time. We've been doing it in healthcare integration for a long time. EMRs have been speaking FHIR and FHIR adjacent formats for quite some time now. And so it's a great time because all of the regulatory bodies are pointed in the same direction. There's a great win for patients and there's a great win for life science companies.
And Dave, I'd like to jump in. Just Adam, you actually sparked a topic I've been thinking a lot about with my team. When we think about sources of data and we think about scalability and sustainability and context that comes with data, looking at a lot of the health coaching startups, I'm thinking of a couple that friends and family are enrolled in today, where they get a kit with probably 15 different devices that they get to experiment with, port that data to a health coach. And, just maybe it's a comment and it's a question, but, these sources and increasingly, as I think health coaching, wellness, and so forth, wellness coaches are going to continue to proliferate, looking at those companies as really data partners, I guess, not only to provide the data, but to provide context, the overlays that they're assigning to the information that they're collecting, and it can be kind of in effect a type of CRO or a trusted CRO partner, perhaps.
You raise a great point. So in the early 2000s, I worked for one of those companies when they were called mediated healthcare companies.
Okay.
They sat between the plan and the patient, helping to mediate care, and they would give you a health navigator. And so to that end, they become data suppliers, right? And figuring out how to standardize all of that data coming off of all of those devices and build a cognizant package of patient data that actually makes sense. There's a bunch of things nobody thinks about. The devices alone keep different time. They're often not aligned. So when you capture that data, you actually have to time synchronize it. And we do some work with the federal government and DoD from a company perspective. And you think about all the devices that a military institution would use, they have the same problems, that the devices don't line up in time. And so you think about personal devices, they're certainly less accurate than military devices. And so there's thinking about, all right, if I want to start to look at this on a patient journey perspective, and I want to see when the events in a patient's set of data occur, whether that's for things like AEs or looking at pharmacovigilance issues, or trying to look at alignment of patient behavior post treatment, post intervention, to see, did their activity come up along with their decrease in blood pressure, increase in heart rate, or increase in just the amount of time and energy they spent exercising, because it was clearly a quality of life win. Being able to align that data, being able to bring it in and store it, and then start to talk about how does that bloom what would have been maybe a gig of data across the whole 5-year study for a patient into something that looks like multiple gigs. And you start to move from gigabytes to terabytes to petabytes of data across a single study. You now have to really think about your data storage solutions and your alignment, and then how do you back that into your existing policies and procedures, right? And so we're looking at that whole arc with folks and trying to help them figure out how to do that relatively painlessly in a somewhat seamless fashion.
Well, it points out a few interesting things, I think, as we see more and more devices emerging and other data sources. We do have a relative explosion of data, and we need hyperscale, cloud platforms to deal with that data. You brought up some interesting points around how artificial intelligence, as those data sets and become larger and larger, it becomes impractical for humans to do much of the analysis. So advances in artificial intelligence, natural language processing, like you talked about, are key. Even upstream things like ambient intelligence and conversational AI that can pick up the recording of data and conversations in those clinical encounters are going to become more and more important. But I think overall, there are many areas where clinical research and clinical care are becoming more and more connected, and it gives us greater access to more data and faster access. But there are a bunch of benefits really from having more research taking place at the point of care, or in home or in retail settings. The care models are shifting, and there are tremendous opportunities for clinical research to take advantage of that. I'm thinking about expanded access and diversity in clinical trials and things like that. I wonder, Kate, if you have any thoughts or experience around that.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation, and it's an exciting time, I think, for ultimately for patients and the providers that that care for them because of the real-time nature of access to and the real-time nature of data generation, right, of information generation. We are now truly in an era where patients are almost entirely engaged, right, in healthcare decision making. And like any good consumer, they want the information. Their caregivers want the information, timely information, accurate information to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families. And I think that that maybe perceived kind of gap between provision of care and research has gotten more and more narrow. You know, it's about, I think, however that information is provided or enabled, I think that the underlying premise or philosophy really needs to be about educating the patient, making them aware of choice, health literacy. And we talk a lot about that from a pharmacovigilance and patient safety perspective. Before we even think about, you know, treatment and prescribing, it's really understanding where the patient is at from a literacy perspective and how to bring the right information in the right format to those individuals. But yeah, the providers obviously play a pivotal key role in that dialogue.
What about you, Adam? Do you have any perspective on some of these shifting models of care and opportunities for clinical research?
I do, and I could spend hours with my civil rights hat on, advocacy hat on, because where I come from, I'm a nurse by trade, which is probably not shared in my bio, but you have, as the continued consolidation of industry happens and everybody is doing everything. So you're seeing, EMR vendors become CROs, and you're seeing, lots of collaborative studies with health systems running their own studies, and you're seeing a lot of the pharmaceutical companies partner with everybody else. The patients can get lost in the mix, right? And we're all supposed to be serving the patients, and so we've got a bunch of nascent problems, not nascent problems. We've got a bunch of existing problems and new nascent ones. The existing ones are, we've got a biased healthcare system that doesn't treat everybody equally, that has very spotty access, and depending on who you are and where you live and how much money you have, the health system really comes to you in a very different fashion. And so, to Kate's really insightful point, we have to meet patients where they are, which means we also have to meet them where their resources are. So not everybody has access to an unlimited data plan. Not everybody has access to internet, even internet access on a regular and even basis. So how do we bring these new technologies and capabilities to those folks, whether that's kiosk-based access, whether that's using non-traditional sites like pharmacies to be research sites, thinking about how do we get into communities where there's none of that access. But then what is the role of the pharma company and the CRO and the provider change to in this integrated model to be an advocate of the patient in their health journey? And the more we do that, the better off the outcomes are going to be, the more satisfaction you get from patients for participation in studies and trials. And quite frankly, the more trust there is in the health system, because we can be transparent, we can be open. And because the ownership of the data is shifting, we're going to have to do this more whether we want to or not. And so where providers were the gatekeepers of this data, that is done. And now you've got shared ownership with patients. So even though the provider owns the EMR and they ostensibly own the support of that data, the patient now has ownership of the data, and the portability is theirs to leverage. And so it's a great time for us to really rethink privacy, permission, even the non-legal aspects of what's the patient bill of rights look like as we bring them into studies? How do we support them in their journey? And then thinking about, well, everybody has different goals. So someone's goal might be just to get back to the function they were at, not necessarily chasing a cure. And so how do you align the patient journey and studies to support all those needs? It's an interesting time. We support a lot of advocacy groups, and one of the things we're seeing a lot more of is a lot of the life sciences companies trying to figure out how to partner well with advocacy groups to really support that patient journey. So lots of opportunity to collaborate, but all with a patient-centric focus in mind.
Yeah. And it seems like almost without exception, that's all goodness for the patient experience and for their care outcomes. Things like how does the regulatory environment impact that in terms of new consent requirements when we're in a distributed hybrid or in that last mile of care delivery. There's both, who is a site, who is a sponsor, who is a research assistant now in this new world of decentralized and oftentimes point of care research setting. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah, Dave, I'll jump in. I mean, I think as I think about, if we just look at pharmacovigilance, but certainly this applies, across the R&D organization of any life sciences company, there's such an opportunity now to really partner, to have a shared seat at the table with regulators, and I'm talking globally, but using FDA as an example. But because of this real-time access to so much information and the need to make almost real-time decisions, I think, and I've observed in the 20 or so years I've been in the industry, just an incredible spirit of kind of, knowledge exchange, right? And sharing information and co-creation and collaboration with regulators that I think is really exciting. And we've seen this evolve in the tech space. We've seen this evolve in, other industries as well. And it really feels like it is like life sciences time, if you will, with all this information in hand and expertise to truly partner and for regulatory and sponsors to help one another.
Yeah, I think
I would agree. I think that there's the spirit of collaboration needs to shift just a bit. And everybody needs to think about, as we share these data sources and we share patient experience, and you've got to change the way that permissioning is done. What does a shared ecosystem look like where you share ownership of data with patients? And you can run it the same way you've been running it. I mean, that people can, but I think you run up against the barriers, and you'll get less patient participation now that they have some of this ownership. So there's certainly opportunity to extend that.
Yeah, I'm wondering for both of you, but maybe Kate first. What are, in terms of meeting the patients halfway and these new patient journey experiences, what does that mean for employees of a pharmaceutical company, and how, what sort of technology and tools have enabled that, but also what has that employee experience been like?
Absolutely. Do we have another hour to discuss? Because I hope maybe we'll have a part two. No, it's a really key question, and I don't think the life sciences industry is alone in answering that question, right? Because at the end of the day, companies are engaging with customers, we're engaging with patients in so many new ways, many of which are social media based. So what does that mean? Going back to our earlier commentary around change management, it's looking at both for R&D and commercial organizations, looking at readiness to adopt innovation, and looking at the operations, just diving deep into processes, into training, into upskilling of employees, so that there's an awareness. I always say to a number of colleagues, you don't have to use TikTok. You don't have to have a TikTok account, but you need to know what it is, because you'll notice if you go to TikTok and Google any number of products, you're going to get hits, right? So there has to be just foundationally, fundamentally, kind of an understanding of what's out there and what that ecosystem looks like. I think that I think pharma, biotech, medtech, I think we've hit a point where all organizations, if they're not already, really need to be looking inward to kind of do that assessment, look at that readiness, look at skills and opportunities to upskill. Because again, if our goal, and I believe when we say we are about our patients, if that is the case, we have to understand how they're engaging with our products, with our brand, and how we can engage with them in more informed ways. So again, I could be another hour-long discussion easily or more, but now is the time. And again, I think this is true across industries, not just the life sciences industry.
Yeah, very much so. Adam, do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I will only add, and I embarrass her every time I say this, but my daughter is 31, so she's an elder millennial. She will not engage in a process that is not digital. She's made it abundantly clear. She says, I don't have to. I can get things the way I want to. So, and she's not the youngest generation. She's now drifting into, I don't want to call her middle-aged. I'm middle-aged, but she's certainly drifting into, you know, the latter phases of adulthood as she starts to change the way her life looks. She's well beyond college, and she's not a kid. And so there's a generation and a half behind her that has the same expectations. And that group of people is also now represents the largest group of people on the planet. And our processes are baked on people my age and older. I'm 51 in a month or so. I'm 50 still, I should say that. I'm not going to claim 51 yet. But really, we really think about this as processes we built 20 years ago that we still haven't advanced to the audience that's at hand, or at least a big chunk of the audience that's at hand. So Kate's right, is you have to be aware internally of what the digital frontier, there's no longer a frontier, looks like. The metaverse is here, whether you like it or not, and people are going to have some expectation about what that looks like. The metaverse already existed because, to the point Kate made as well, TikTok and Instagram have more influence over young people's ideas about everything than any bit of a web piece that you put out or a news article, right? They're just not going to have the weight that you want them to. So how do you take advantage of those spaces and communicate with people in another dialect? And that's really all it is, right? It's the dialect of the era. So stop resisting it, be engaged. You don't have an expert, find one. Talk to my daughter, she'll help you. There's an opportunity there. But certainly we should embrace it, because it is a methodology for reaching a very broad scale of people in a way that they're clearly comfortable in communicating. And we should think about that holistically.
Adam, I'll just jump in. I think it was Jack Welch, maybe GE had a reverse mentoring program, right?
Yes.
Grab a 22-year-old, grab a 25-year-old, you know, and sit down and I mean, it sounds simple, but actually it can really create a cultural shift, a digital readiness shift by just
100%.
People, again, people connections. Yeah.
Yes. And you see the same thing in pediatrics, right? Yeah. So really thinking about, you know, talk to children about their experiences.
Yeah.
You know, talk to their parents and ask them the same questions, because now the patient journey includes kids. And if you're going to collect data from them, and you're going to collect data from the parents of children, thinking about the caregiver journey is the other piece that we ignore a lot of the time. But in so many cases, we're actually asking for data from caregivers and not the patient themselves. So just yet another place, to your point, Kate, meet them where they are.
That's great. Some really salient points there in terms of, you know, we can't avoid things like the latest social media platforms or the emerging metaverse, which actually is pretty cool and interesting. Really, we need to be embracing these tools and capabilities. And to be inclusive of everybody, but also take advantage of the innovation that's happening there as well. So that's fantastic. I'd like to, if we could, just shift gears to some of our questions that have been going through the Q&A window. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Matt O'Donnell, if he can serve up some of the questions that we're seeing.
Sure, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you,
Dave, Kate, and Adam. Got a handful of great questions here. So the first one is, For medical device tools like smart pill caps that record medication adherence data, how should these med device companies package their data for easy integration with CRO provider healthcare organizations?
JSON, I'll say it right away. Look, I don't want to be prescriptive, but JSON is read by almost everything. It's actually a nice verbose standard. And if you can think of something like JSON, for those who don't know, it's essentially like XML. It's just an easy to read computer-based format that actually humans can read also. It is a nice way to package data. It can be shipped. It's lightweight. It shows up as text. It can be stored anywhere. And most modern databases have an ability to read JSON natively through either a plugin or some other methodology. And so it's actually a really nice way to transmit data. But I would say, short of JSON, standards-based. So you can also ship it in FHIR and ship it as observations, which is also not a bad choice. FHIR converts to JSON. You see where I'm going? It can be loaded. So yeah, really easy opportunities there, and a light lift from a build perspective. I don't know. Other thoughts? It's a relatively technical question, but I'm happy to answer.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent.
And too, if you do it that way.
And that question was from Alexander, by the way. Thank you, Alexander. And the next question
is Alexander.
Is from Valerie. Does data ownership, assuming with sponsor during clinical research and with a patient or provider in a regular case, represent a hurdle for CROs to draw insights for better patient outcomes?
Who wants to start? I mean, this can be the place where I say I only play a lawyer on TV. I'm not a lawyer at IQVIA. I will say that for sure. I work in the technology department. I build tech. I can say though, it does create a hurdle because you have to think about informed consent, and you want to be inclusive, and you want to think about how you're going to leverage patient data, but you also want to think about protocol design. So we'll take just one example. EMR data is a good one. Everybody asks about how do you integrate EMR data, because now patients can either mediate it or you can get it from sites either inside of the US or outside of the US. There's opportunities. And if you're going to ask for data, especially going to ask for it from the patient repeatedly, then you want to think about, I may want to change this now that I can collect longitudinal data. I want to talk to patients about, I want to collect this from you once every 6 months. I want to collect this breadth of data. So we're going to collect these type of things from your medications and your procedures. Or do you want to ask for a holistic blanket access to the data and share with them what you're going to do with it? But the other thing to think about, which I think is one of the ways to get over the hurdle, is also what will you share back with the patient after you collect it? So if you're going to collect their EMR data, put it in a health wallet for them so they can use it afterwards. It's a huge win. The patient now has a portable record. They've already collected it. And if you're working through native device capability, they can actually pull it into the health wallet and share it with you. And so there's an opportunity there where there's a give back for the patient. And so you want to think about both sides of this, which is, yes, there's a legal requirement. You have to change informed consent. And if you're encouraging patients by offering them something in return, you're going to reduce the likelihood that they're not interested in sharing that data with you.
Adam, I'll just add to that, something someone shared with me, particularly during COVID-19 and some work that I did on a symptom tracking app. This was pre-joining AbbVie, but informed consent and patient education, it's a process. It's an ongoing dialogue. So if you think about informed consent and engaging with patients as this ongoing dialogue and always putting their needs first, that's a great path to follow in terms of making the right decisions and maybe a good lens to look at these types of seemingly insurmountable hurdles.
Excellent. Thank you. Then the next question is coming in from Dr. Gergely. For professional telemedicine consultation, you need a qualified consultant. The consultant must have instant access to patients' complete medical records and documentation for the medical record and medical legal. So the question is, how do you plan instant medical record access?
Well, yeah, so the problem is that telehealth gets thrown around as a very broad definition, and there's a difference between televisit and telehealth. And so when we think about studies or trials, there's visits that don't necessarily engage in any actual care delivery, where I want to give the patient the ability to talk to somebody. So whether it's somebody in a call center to collect data, it's a researcher, even a provider, where I'm not delivering care, but I might be collecting information. In that scenario, we don't have these requirements. The requirements are different because I'm just collecting data from the patient. In the delivery of telehealth, though, Dr. Gergley is 100% right. You need the full record available. Most modern telehealth solutions, and we've been integrating with a bunch of them. You'll see a lot of them out there now. They do awful lot of marketing. Have direct either FHIR or API or behind the firewall integration to the EMR record, so that the provider can browse the patient's chart in real time to look at that record while they're talking to the patient. A lot of the newer solutions are also providing access to that data to the patient as well, so that it can co-browse together, so the provider can share, here's your test results, let's look at them together, let's have a conversation. You're seeing a lot more of this combined journey, which to me feels the right place to be as a patient advocate, is anytime you can offer that to both sides. So the patient can also pull up a piece of their record and push it back to the provider and say, I don't understand this test, or I have a question about this procedure, or I'm looking at this result and I don't know what it is. So those solutions exist. All of the major EMRs have partners who now can offer a smart on FHIR or a FHIR-based integration of the health record plus that telehealth capability. And you're seeing an explosion of this, I think, on the back of COVID, where you had some states that moved all of their mental health visits to telehealth, 100% at the state level. So they've solved this problem. I think it's a boon for clinicians, because you really now have all the tools wrapped up in a single box and a couple of interfaces that you can leverage. But 100% that you definitely need those requirements from a visit perspective. But I think the solutioning is there. It's probably a whole other conversation about the innovation in the clinical space, but definitely an interesting time.
Excellent. I got a follow-on question or two from Alexander. So who owns the data? For example, if collected medication adherence during a clinical trial, would the company, the patient, or the sponsor own the data? And then a secondary aspect of that is, do we think blockchain, or let's just say any other technology, will be required for patient-owned data?
The dreaded blockchain that always says. I'll give my attorney responses, which is it depends. I'll give you an example. So patient has a health wallet on their phone, right? They have an iPhone, they're using HealthKit. They take the data from their health record, they put it on their phone. Patient owns the data, done, no problem. Now the patient shares the data through a clinical trial app or a study app with the CRO, and they park it with IQVIA for argument's sake, because we're executing a trial on behalf of a sponsor. At that point, we're just the custodian, if you will, and the sponsor ultimately owns that parsed data where they've enriched it and done something to it through informed consent. The patient has passed on data to be shared for a commercial purpose, and here it is. The patient still owns their set of the data. To reuse that data beyond what the patient has granted you permission for, I would suggest, and this is me in my own personal Adam close, not IQVIA close, saying as an attorney, you'd be hard pressed to prove in a court of law that you had permission to use that data for anything else. So if you're going to use that data for downstream purposes, I would suggest expanding the informed consent for that usage. And I think as we go forward and you see more and more legal opinions come out about what happens when patients own the data, you're going to see more of those things. So transparency is key. I'm going to use it for the following purposes, which include this study and maybe some follow-on research or marketing. You okay with that? Yes, no. Give them opportunities to opt in and out of some of those sub-bullets so that you have a flexible consent. So if they don't want you to use it for future marketing, you can still use it for the study. And And then think about in the joint ownership where patients are continuing to collect this data about themselves, do you want to engage them in an ongoing relationship where you can actually collect more data from them and use it? Reconsent them when the consent changes. You have another idea, it's something you want, ask them. And if you're transparent, it's not a problem. I think where people are going to get into trouble is they're not transparent about what actually happens. You immediately violate GDPR. So I was being US centric for a moment, but once you get in the GDPR space, you really don't have any choices. You have to be 100% frank with people about what you're doing, and the permissions are even tighter. So transparency, I think, is key. Kate was nodding along, so I assume she agrees.
No, totally agree. And I thought I had, and just kind of scanning the questions here, Dave and Adam, and Adam, an earlier point you made about kind of the exchange of information. What are you giving patients essentially for that information exchange? And everyone is, of course, very interested in seeing their own data. The other thing they're also very interested in, and I saw a question here about chronic illness management as an example, they want community. They want to find others like them, whether it's the patient, the caregivers, but that community piece is so key. And so I think in this ongoing dialogue about, data ownership and kind of what am I getting for my data? What are you doing with my data? That connection piece, particularly for chronically ill, but not specific to, just connecting with other patients, other communities, can be so critical and so valuable to patients on their journey and to their caregivers.
You're 100% correct. So we have I would say the privilege of working both with advocacy groups and life science groups. So, we're one of the largest providers of registries in that space. So we get to talk to folks who have found a way to engage patients without paying them, without engaging them in studies, just because, to your point, they're looking for community, they're looking for information, they're looking for shared journey and for a friendly ear through a difficult process. I come from a family with some pretty significant rare condition, long-term care needs from a chronic care perspective. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get aligned to a journey, who's the right doc to talk to, what are other patients experiencing, what treatments have worked, where are their clinical trials that are available. And I think, as a give back to patients, supporting connections with advocacy communities is a really big one. A simple referral to an advocacy group for the condition that patient has is a huge one. Here's a handshake, and here's a trusted entity, and using those organizations as a base for recruitment, as a base for engagement, for looking at care guidelines for a lot of things. So there's certainly a huge opportunity to collaborate in that space. And most of those advocacy institutions are really interested in being engaged in this discussion.
Absolutely. And Dave, to an earlier question you had, just the impact of COVID-19, I think everything Adam has described was made more true during the pandemic, for sure.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Absolutely. I didn't want to ignore the blockchain question, Dave. People ask me about blockchain all the time. They ask me about it as an attorney.
You're gonna have to type your answer into that.
But whoever asked that question, I'm happy to follow up offline about blockchain. I have many feelings.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's a good breaking point. We do have a few more questions. We'll try to get to those in the chat, but as far as the live session goes, I think it's a good point right here to wrap it up. I want to thank all of our participants for investing the time today to listen to this panel discussion. I especially want to thank Kate and Adam for bringing your expertise and ideas and thoughts to this discussion. So thank you both. And with that, we'll wrap it up.
Thank you to Dave and all of our speakers. Please visit our website at HLTH.com to catch up on all Health Go Live webinars. And join us in Las Vegas, November 13th through 16th for Health 2022.